There are doors in the world that most people will never stand in front of. Not because they are locked, though they are, but because the kind of people who guard them have a way of making the very idea of approaching feel impossible. Kensington Palace is full of such doors. Heavy, silent watched. The kind of doors that do not rattle. The kind that, if you somehow reach them, you would find a man already standing there, eyes forward, jaw set, hand nowhere near his radio because he would not need it. He would handle it himself. On an ordinary Tuesday morning in late autumn, one of those men stood outside a corridor that wound through the eastern residential wing, a part of the palace most visitors would never see, most staff would never enter, and most of the public did not even know existed. His name does not appear in any official statement. It rarely does. Guards like him are trained to be invisible in the record, present in the room. He had been stationed at this post for 4 hours. His shift had 2 more to go. He had drunk his coffee at 6, eaten nothing since, and spent the morning watching a particular stretch of quiet hallway do exactly what it was supposed to do. Nothing. Then something moved at the far end that was not supposed to be there. The palace grounds at that hour were not empty. They never truly are. Groundskeepers moved through the gardens in the gray morning light. Kitchen staff rotated in and out of the service entrance. A car had come in, gone from the courtyard before 7. All of it accounted for. All of it logged. None of it was the figure the guard saw stepping through a doorway at the end of the hall. A doorway that, according to every schedule he had memorized, should have opened to no one for another 45 minutes. He did not move immediately. A less experienced man might have. A less experienced man might have shouted or reached for something or made the kind of noise that turns a situation from a question into a confrontation. This guard had been doing this long enough to know that the first 3 seconds after you notice something wrong are not for reacting. They are for reading. He read the figure. Male, medium height, dressed in what could pass, at a glance, for maintenance clothing, but only at a glance. The trousers were wrong. Too clean. The jacket did not have the small embroidered patch on the left chest that every contracted maintenance worker wore. The boots were not steel-toed. These were not the details a casual observer would catch. The guard was not a casual observer. He began to walk. Not fast. Not with any obvious urgency. The way a man walks when he owns the floor beneath him, when there is no scenario in which this ends badly for him, when the outcome has already been decided and the only thing left is the formality of arrival. The figure at the end of the corridor had not seen him yet. The figure was looking at the doors. Specifically, and this detail would matter later, would be the detail that made Kate's breath stop and made the princess's protection officers hold a quiet, furious meeting that afternoon. The figure was looking at one door in particular. A door set slightly apart from the others. A door with a small paper butterfly taped to the lower half. The kind made from pale pink construction paper, slightly crumpled at one wing, the kind a 5-year-old makes and a mother keeps. Princess Charlotte's door. The figure raised one hand. The guard covered the last 20 feet in a way that was not a run, but was not walking either. Later, when he filed the internal report, he would describe it as a controlled approach at speed. The figure turned at the last second, registered the guard, registered that there was no version of this conversation that went well, and took one step backward that gained him nothing. "Stop there," the guard said. And the figure stopped. What happened in the next 4 minutes was quiet. The palace does not do loud. Loud is for the people outside the gates, the photographers, the commentators, the world that watches the family from a distance and narrates their lives in headlines. Inside, things happen in low voices, in firm hands on arms, in the specific silence that falls when someone who has made a very bad decision realizes the full weight of it. The figure was walked, not dragged, down the hall and out through a service corridor. 2 more officers materialized from somewhere, from everywhere from the walls it seemed, because that is what good security looks like, and the thing was done, except for the item. When they brought him to the small room off the service corridor, and the senior protection officer went through his pockets and jacket, the room changed. Not loudly, not with shouting, but the air changed. The way air changes in a place where something is suddenly very serious. The officer looked at what he had pulled from the inside pocket of that too-clean jacket and set it on the table without a word. The two other officers looked at it. Nobody spoke for a moment. It was not a weapon, not in the conventional sense, not the thing a person pictures when they hear the word intruder and then the word item. It was something else entirely, something that raised a completely different category of question, something that meant this was not a random trespass, not a confused tourist who had wandered past the gate and kept walking, not a thrill seeker trying to get close to royalty. This was planned. This was specific. This was aimed. And it was aimed at a little girl. Charlotte had been inside her room at that hour. It was confirmed later. She had been there, presumably at her small desk with her books and her pencils and whatever project occupied her that morning, 3 feet from a door that a man she had never met had been reaching for. The paper butterfly on the lower half of the door had been put there by her own hands. Her mother had let her tape it up the previous week. Kate did not learn about the incident immediately. That is not how it works. The protocols are layered. The information moves upward through the chain before it comes back down to the family, filtered, assessed, shaped into something that can be communicated without creating panic. By the time a member of the senior household staff found a quiet moment to speak with her, several hours had passed. The situation had been contained. The figure had been removed and handed to the relevant authorities. The corridor had returned to its particular silence. She listened. She asked one question. Then she asked about the item. When they told her what it was, she did not cry. She's not a woman who cries easily in front of others. The years inside that family, inside that particular goldfish bowl of observation and expectation, fall that reflex down to almost nothing. But the color left her face. That was what the staff member noticed afterward. Not tears, just the way the color simply went. She asked to see it. They told her they could not allow that. It was evidence. It had been logged. It would be processed through the proper channels. Kate nodded. She asked one more question. The question any mother would ask, the question that has nothing to do with protocols or chains of command or proper channels. The question that is just, was she safe? Yes, they told her. She was safe. The guard had made sure of that. But the days that followed were not simple. Because once you know that a man stood outside your daughter's door with a specific item and a specific intention, the silence of the corridor does not go back to being comfortable. It becomes a different kind of silence. A listening silence. The kind a mother carries with her from room to room, from morning to night, the kind that does not appear in any official statement and is not logged in any report. Charlotte herself never knew. She was 5. She had her butterfly on the door and her books on the desk and her morning uninterrupted. The palace held the thing quietly, the way it holds most things. Privately. With controlled competence. With the practiced discretion of an institution that has been managing crises since before crises had press officers. But the item sat in an evidence bag somewhere in a back room of that institution, waiting. And it told a story that was not finished yet. The investigators who opened the file that evening did not know the man's full name yet. Not the real one. They had a face. They had a jacket with wrong details. They had the item on the table. They had a timeline, approximate, being reconstructed minute by minute from camera logs and access records and the quiet, precise memory of a guard who had stood in that hall for 4 hours and noticed everything. They had the beginning of something. What they did not have yet was why. Why that door? Why that morning? Why that item, which did not threaten the way a weapon threatens? Directly, obviously, but threatened in a way that required understanding, context, history. The kind of threat that is worse in some ways because it reveals knowledge. Because it says, I know things about this child that I should not know. I have been paying attention. I have been close enough, long enough to know where her room is and what she keeps near her door and when the corridor would be at its quietest. That kind of knowledge does not arrive by accident. Someone had been watching. The guard who had stopped it all, who had read the figure in 3 seconds and walked those 20 feet and said the 2 words that ended it, went back to his post after his debrief. His shift ran its last 2 hours without incident. He filed his report. He drank another coffee. The palace returned to its rhythms, its schedules, its careful management of a life lived inside history. Outside the gates, the morning went on. Tourists photographed the facade. Cars moved through the streets of Kensington. A November wind came up and bent the trees in the garden. The world outside had no idea. It rarely does. The man's name, when they found it, was unremarkable. It belonged to a person who had made himself unremarkable deliberately, carefully, with the kind of patience that investigators find more unsettling than violence. Violence is loud. It leaves marks. It announces itself. Patience is quiet. It accumulates. It arrives at a destination that loud things never reach because loud things get stopped at the gate. Patience wears the right jacket and learns the maintenance schedules and times its approach to a corridor during the narrowest window of reduced oversight and almost gets to a door. Almost. His background, when the investigators pulled it apart in the days following his arrest, was not the background of a man with obvious criminal history. No record. No flag. The kind of absence of history that is itself a kind of history. A person who had managed to pass through systems without leaving fingerprints. He had held jobs. Ordinary ones. He had rented a flat in a part of London that was not remarkable. He had paid his bills with the specific consistency of a person trying not to draw attention. The investigators call this type of behavior low signature. It means a person who knows they're being looked for, or could be, and has organized their entire life around not being seen. What they found when they went into his flat told a different story. The flat was clean on the surface. Organized. The kind of organized that belongs to a certain type of obsession. Not the chaos of instability, but its opposite, the eerie order of a person who has been concentrating very hard on one thing for a long time. The kitchen was tidy. The bedroom, unremarkable. The living room, which he appeared to have used primarily as a workspace, was something else entirely. One wall was dedicated. That is the word the investigating officer used in the debrief. Dedicated. Photographs. Printed articles. Handwritten notes. Not the splashed, frantic wall of a person in crisis. Something more methodical than that. A chronology, it appeared. A careful assembly of information arranged to tell a story or to track one. And the subject of that story, assembled over what appeared to be at least 14 months of collection, was not the royal family in general. Not Charles. Not William. Not Kate herself, though she appeared in some of the material. It was Charlotte. A 5-year-old child had been the subject of 14 months of focused, patient, organized attention from a man who had then dressed himself in almost correct maintenance clothing and walked to within arm's reach of her bedroom door. The item he carried made more sense now, set against that wall. It was not random. It was the culmination of something. It was the object at the end of a very long, very quiet line of intent. The investigators spent time with it. They photographed it, cataloged it, cross-referenced it against the material on the wall. There was a connection, specific, traceable, the kind that told them this man had not grabbed something on his way out the door. He had chosen it. He had planned to bring it to that door. He had a reason. What that reason was is the part that Kate was eventually told. Not immediately. Not even in the first week. The household staff and the protection officers and the quiet people in unremarkable suits who handle these matters had a way of determining, through experience and instinct and their own difficult calculus, when a parent needed to know something and when knowing it would do more damage than the knowing was worth. They held it. They assessed. They argued, probably in their careful institutional way. They decided. When Kate was finally told the full context, the wall, the photographs, the months of collection, the specific nature of the item, and what it represented about the man's intentions, she sat very still. The person who told her described it afterward as controlled. That word again, controlled, that sits over everything in that world like a weather system. She asked questions, precise ones. She had done her own processing by then, in the days between first hearing about the incident and learning its depth, and she arrived at the full briefing already armored, already in the part of herself that is not just a mother, but a person who chose, with full knowledge, to walk into a life where this is always possible and has learned to hold it without breaking. She asked about the photographs, whether Charlotte appeared in them from inside the palace or only from public engagements. They told her, only public, taken from the crowd, from a distance. Nothing that indicated he had been inside before, nothing that suggested internal access beyond what he had attempted that morning. It was one of the few things in the briefing that could be described as reassuring, and Kate held it the way you hold something small and warm when the room around you is cold. She asked about the item again, more specifically this time. Not just what it was, but what it meant, what the investigators believe he intended to do with it. That part of the answer is not on record. Or rather, it is on record somewhere inside the specific privacy of an ongoing criminal investigation that has not been made public, inside a file that sits in the kind of building that has no sign outside. What is observable from the behavior of the people around Kate in the weeks that followed, from small adjustments made to the household schedule, from a quiet increase in the visible presence of protection officers during Charlotte's daily routines, is that the answer to that question changed something. Not broke it, changed it. William was told separately, briefed, as is the process, through the protection officer chain rather than through household staff. The information routed to him in the way information is routed to the person who will eventually have to decide what to do with it publicly, institutionally, legally. He is whatever else. A man who understands that his children exist at the intersection of private life and public risk in a way that almost no one else on the planet fully comprehends. He had been briefed before on similar incidents. Threats logged and managed. Letters intercepted. People removed from public spaces before they reached the family. He had been briefed enough to know how to sit with the information and then stand up and continue, because continuing is what the role demands. This briefing was different. The investigators could see it in him. Not in any dramatic way. He does not do dramatic. It is not in the toolkit, but in the quality of his stillness. The way a man goes still when something has reached through the professional distance and touched the part of him that is just a father. Charlotte had no idea. She was told nothing. She went to her lessons. She had her meals. She played in the garden during the afternoon window of thin November sun. And she did not know that the paper butterfly on her door had been within reach of a man who had spent 14 months thinking about her. She did not know that the corridor outside her room had been the site of something that would be discussed in classified briefings for weeks. She did not know any of it. She was 5. She knew her butterfly was a good one because one wing was slightly crumpled and her mother had not fixed it, had left it exactly as Charlotte had made it, which meant it was perfect. The guard who had stopped everything was not publicly acknowledged. He would not be. That is the nature of the work. The success stories are the ones nobody hears. The near misses caught before they become misses. The disasters that do not happen because someone stood in a corridor for 4 hours and noticed. He received an internal commendation that is not a document the public will ever read. He was told by the senior protection officer that he had done his job exactly as it was supposed to be done. High praise in that language. The highest, possibly. He nodded. He went back to work. The investigation moved through its careful stages. The man in the unremarkable flat was charged. The charges are specific in ways that require legal precision. The law around threatening behavior, and the law around protection of minors, and the law around unlawful entry into a protected residence form a particular kind of web. And the case was threaded through it with the thoroughness of a prosecution team that understood the public nature of what they were handling. A child of the royal family. A nursery corridor. An item that could not, under any interpretation, be explained away. His defense, when it came, attempted to construct him as disturbed rather than dangerous. The distinction matters legally. It matters less to a mother. Whatever the legal determination of his mental state, Kate knew what was on that wall. She knew how many months. She knew the specificity of the photographs, the careful arrangement, the choice of item. Disturbed and dangerous are not mutually exclusive. They coexist in the same person all the time. The palace's legal advisors made this argument quietly and through proper channels to ensure the prosecution did not lose it to the narrative of a troubled man who meant no real harm. A troubled man had stood at her daughter's door. The weeks that followed had a different texture than the weeks before. Not visibly. The family continued its schedule, its public appearances, its managed life inside the perpetual observation of being them. Charlotte's school runs continued. Her public appearances continued. The world watched the photographs and saw a child who was fine, who was thriving, who had her mother's composure and her father's something harder underneath. None of that was performance exactly. It was just that living in that family requires a specific skill, the ability to be genuinely okay and genuinely not okay at the same time, in the same body on the same morning. Kate had that skill. She had been building it for years. She held what she knew about the wall and the flat, and the item on the table, and the 14 months of collective photographs of her daughter, and she held it alongside the ordinary fact of Charlotte's breakfast, and Charlotte's questions about whatever she was curious about that day, and Charlotte's slightly crumpled butterfly on the door. She held it all. She did not let the one contaminate the other. That is the extraordinary thing about her. Not the composure which can be trained, which the palace trains, which the role demands. The extraordinary thing is that the composure does not appear to hollow her out. The grief and fear and controlled fury of knowing what she now knew did not make her distant from Charlotte. If anything, those who were close to her in the weeks after said the opposite. She was more present, more likely to stop and sit with the children for an extra few minutes. More likely to let a morning run a little slow. The butterfly stayed on the door. She did not take it down. Did not move Charlotte to a different room. Did not change the morning routines in ways Charlotte would notice and ask about. Because Charlotte would ask. She is that kind of child, bright, attentive, the kind of attentiveness that reads rooms without being taught to. Kate knew that any visible change in how she was being handled would register. Children of that age feel the temperature of adult concern even when the adults believe they are hiding it perfectly. So the butterfly stayed, and the temperature stayed normal. And somewhere in a building with no sign outside, a file sat in a locked system, and the man who had planned and prepared and dressed himself carefully and walked to within arm's reach of that door waited for his hearing date. And the guard who had stopped him went back to standing in corridors, watching hallways do exactly what they were supposed to do. Most of the time, they do. That is what people outside those gates do not fully understand. Not the threat, but the sheer volume of the ordinary that surrounds it. The thousands of unremarkable hours for every hour that holds something wrong. The shift after shift after shift of a man standing in a hallway, watching nothing happen, being entirely prepared for something to happen, understanding that the only measure of success is that it does not. The invisibility of good protection is the whole point of good protection. You build a system of walls invisible enough that people forget they are there, strong enough that when something comes, it holds. The wall holds. It held that morning. The question that lingered, that the investigators carried home with them, that Kate turned over in the quiet hours, was not whether it had held this time. It was what else and how many and when. It always is. The hearing came on a gray morning in February. Not the kind of February that surprises you. Not cold and sharp and honest about itself, but the gray, wet, specific kind that London does, the kind that arrives without drama and settles in as if it owns the place, as if it has always been here and always will be. The kind of morning that has no opinion about what happens inside the buildings beneath it. Courthouses on mornings like that look like every other building on the street. Unremarkable. Just a place where things get decided. The man from the flat arrived in a way that had been carefully managed. Through a side entrance. In a vehicle without markings. At a time when the small group of photographers who had gotten word of the hearing would be positioned at the front. He was not trying to escape attention, or rather, his legal team was not trying to generate it, which is a different thing. In cases involving the royal family, and particularly cases involving a child, the media management is delicate in both directions. Too much silence invites speculation. Too much access invites a kind of coverage that turns a criminal proceeding into something it was not designed to be. Kate was not there. She would not be there. She had made this decision clearly and early. Her attendance would turn the thing into theater in a way that would serve no one. Not the prosecution, not Charlotte, not any functional outcome of the proceeding. Her absence was itself a statement, which the people who managed these things understood. Her presence would have been a different statement, and the wrong one for this moment. She stayed at Kensington. She kept to the schedule that Charlotte knew. Inside the courtroom, the prosecution presented a case that was, in the institutional language of criminal proceedings, thorough. The word that appeared in the internal notes of those following, it was methodical. The wall and the flat had been photographed and documented with the care of people who understood that juries are human beings who need to see things to understand them, who need the physical reality of 14 months arranged on a wall to comprehend what 14 months of this kind of attention means. The photographs were presented. The timeline was presented. The maintenance clothing, the wrong trousers, the missing embroidered patch, all of it walked through for the record, given weight, made concrete. The item was presented last. It had been the evidence chain since the morning the guard had filed his report, since the officer had set it on the small table in the room off the service corridor, and the air had changed. It had been logged and photographed and cross-referenced and analyzed and now presented to the court in the quiet, specific language of forensic evidence. What it was, what it indicated, what the connection to the material on the wall meant in terms of intent. The word intent is load-bearing in criminal law. It is the difference between a man who wandered somewhere he should not have been and a man who prepared, planned, timed, and came to a particular door with a particular object for a particular purpose. The prosecution argued intent, argued it through the wall, the timeline, the clothing, the item, argued it through the 14 months of photographs and handwritten notes, argued it through the specific door he had been reaching for, not a random door in the corridor, not the nearest door, not the easiest door to reach. The one with the paper butterfly, the child's door, the door he had known was hers. The defense argued diminished responsibility. The defense always argues something. In this case, what they built was a portrait of a man who had become unhealthily preoccupied, who had lost perspective, whose mental state had deteriorated in ways that should qualify as mitigation. It is a coherent legal argument. It is sometimes a true one. Preoccupation and deterioration are real things that happen to real people and sometimes produce real tragedies. The difficulty in this case was the wall. The difficulty was the timeline. The difficulty was the specific, precise, patient construction of a plan over 14 months by a man whose jacket had been deliberately altered to almost but not quite pass for maintenance clothing. Deterioration does not produce almost. Almost is a product of calculation. The judge understood this. The verdict, when it came, not that same day, but days later, after the particular patience of deliberation, was what it was. Guilty on the charges of unlawful entry into a protected residence, threatening behavior toward a minor, and possession of an item with intent to cause psychological harm. The last charge was the one the defense had fought hardest, the one that required the most careful legal architecture, the most precise language, the closest reading of the item, and its connection to the evidence on the wall. The prosecution had built it well. It held. The sentencing was separate. That comes later, on another gray morning, in the same unremarkable building. What had been delivered, for now, was the verdict, the thing itself. The legal acknowledgement that what had happened in that corridor was not nothing, was not confused, was not accidental, was planned, was aimed, was stopped by a man standing in a hallway doing exactly his job. Kate was told in the early afternoon of the verdict day. She received the news in the same way she had received everything about this situation, sitting still, asking precise questions, holding the information with the specific posture of a person who has taught herself that falling apart is a thing she can do later, privately, not now. She asked about the sentencing timeline. She asked whether the verdict would be made public. It would, in general terms, without the specifics that would identify Charlotte as the child involved, though the connection to Kensington would be enough for anyone paying attention. She asked who would manage the press in the first 24 hours. Then, she asked to be left alone for a few minutes. What happened in those few minutes is not on record. It happened in a room without cameras, without staff, without the institutional machinery that manages every other moment of her life. It was private in the way almost nothing in her life is private. Whatever she felt, the relief, the residual fear, the anger that had never fully resolved, the specific grief of knowing what had been planned for her daughter, and how close it had come. She felt it then, alone in those few minutes. Then she came back out. Charlotte was in the garden. She had been given extra time outside that afternoon. One of the small, invisible adjustments that had been made throughout the months of this investigation, the minor recalibrations of daily life that a child feels as warmth without understanding them as protection. More time outside, more flexibility in the afternoon schedule, more of Kate sitting on the grass when the weather allowed, watching her play, being there in the specific way that is not hovering but is present, the kind of presence that says, I see you. You are here. You are safe. Charlotte was chasing something. A pigeon, possibly, or a fallen leaf. The garden still had them in February, the last stubborn ones that had clung through November and December and into the new year before finally letting go. She was running in the specific way of children who are running for the pleasure of it, with no destination, no strategy, no economy of movement. Just running because their legs can, and the ground is there, and the world is large, and they are in it. Kate watched from the doorway. The paper butterfly was still on Charlotte's door. Kate had passed it on the way to the garden. She passed it every day, multiple times. At first, in the weeks right after the incident, before the fullness of it had been told to her, and even more so after, it had been hard to pass. I went to it. The gut followed. The knowledge of what had been reaching for that door sat beneath every passing like a stone beneath shallow water. Not hidden, just submerged. It was less submerged now. The verdict did not make it disappear. Nothing makes it disappear entirely. That is the honest truth of threats and the people who carry them. They leave a residue. Even when the person is found, charged, convicted. Even when the system does exactly what it is supposed to do. The residue remains in the body of every parent who stood where Kate stood, on the other side of something that came too close, carrying the knowledge of it, learning to carry it without letting it change the weight of everything else. But the butterfly looked like a butterfly again, just a child's paper butterfly, one wing slightly crumpled, tape visible at the corners, the pink a little faded. The kind of thing that should be on child's door. Unremarkable. Exactly right. In the days that followed the verdict, something the investigating team had said during one of the briefings stayed with the senior protection officer who had overseen the case from the palace side. He was not a man given to reflection in the way that generates quotable sentences. He was a practical person doing a practical job in service of a practical goal: keep the family safe. But he had spent enough months inside this particular case, enough time with the wall and the flat, and the item and the careful, terrible patience of 14 months that it had left something in him. Not a scar exactly, a sharpening. What he said in a post-case debrief that was not public was this: the guard had not stopped an intruder. The intruder had been stopped 100 times before he reached the corridor, in the decisions made about access points and schedule management and uniform verification in the systems that should have caught an anomaly before it became a presence in the hall. The guard was the last line. The last line should not be the only line. In this case, it had worked. The last line had held. But the case had also revealed gaps, not dramatic ones, not cinematic failures of an overconfident system. Quiet ones, small ones, the kind of gaps that only become visible in retrospect when you trace backward from a man in a corridor to the 14 months before he got there and ask at each step, where's the point where this could have been different? The review that followed the case was not publicized. Reviews of this kind rarely are. They happen inside the institution in the specific language of protocols and access management and vetting procedures, in the careful notation of what had worked and what had not and what needed to change. The palace is old at this, older than any living person, old in the institutional memory that passes between generations of staff and officers and advisors who understand that the business of protecting this family is never finished, never perfected, only continually refined by every near miss and every lesson the near misses teach. It refined itself again, quietly, in the way it always does. The guard who had stood in the corridor took no particular pleasure in the verdict. He had been asked about it, carefully by the right people through appropriate channels. He said what he said. He had done his job. He did not want recognition for doing his job. Recognition is for people who did more than their job, and he did not believe he had. He had been there. He had noticed. He had acted in the way he was trained to act. That was all. That was the whole of it. He went back to his post. The months moved. The case entered the category of things that are known, but not widely known, understood by the people who were inside it, referenced in internal documents, part of the institutional memory of Kensington Palace's security history. Not a story that circulates at dinner parties. Not a headline that runs for more than a day before the world moves on. The world moves fast. It has a great appetite for the next thing. Charlotte turned 6. She had a birthday party with her friends, and the garden was decorated, and there was a cake that was probably not as complicated as she had requested, because cakes for 6-year-olds should always be more complicated than what the baker can do. That is the correct ratio. She blew out candles in the way of children who take candle blowing very seriously, who put everything into it, who close their eyes and wish with their whole face. She had no idea that the year she was turning 6 was the year a man had stood outside her door and been stopped by a guard who had learned to read a corridor in 3 seconds and act in a way that produces no noise, no drama, no evidence except the absence of harm. She had no idea. She only knew the butterfly was still there. She had checked it that morning. Still pink. Still a little crumpled. Still exactly right. Kate had watched her check it. Had watched her pat it with 2 fingers the way you pat something you made and are proud of. Had felt the thing she feels in those moments, the thing that does not have a name that fits inside a sentence cleanly, that is too large for language, that is composed of love and fear and gratitude in some proportion that shifts depending on the day and what she knows and what she is holding. She felt it. She let herself feel it. That is the thing about extraordinary mothers that is not said enough. Not the composure, not the management, not the capacity to function under the weight of what they carry. The extraordinary thing is the refusal to become numb to it. The continuing willingness to feel the whole thing, even the terrifying parts, because the alternative is a distance from the child that would be its own kind of loss. The butterfly stayed on the door. The guard stood in the corridor. The world outside the gates went about its business, unaware. Inside, the palace breathed. The particular slow breath of an institution that has survived centuries of threats, small and large, by building walls that do not need to be visible to hold. Walls that were the ordinary face of duty. Walls that stand in hallways for 4 hours and drink their coffee at 6 and notice everything and act in the 3 seconds that matter and do not need anyone to call them hero for doing it. A child chased a pigeon in the garden. Her mother watched from the doorway. The butterfly waited, patient and slightly crumpled on the door. Everything, for now, was exactly as it was supposed to be.